The letter hit the table between them like a verdict from God himself. Lavinia Talmadge had not moved since the moment Clarence Sullivan walked through the door of her general store in Redemption Creek, Colorado, on that blistering July afternoon in 1882. She had not moved, had not breathed, had not done anything at all except stare at the folded, water-stained, sun-bleached envelope that he set down in front of her with hands that were trembling ever so slightly, hands that were enormous and scarred and brown from 2 years of mountain wind and Colorado sun. Hands that had carried this letter across impossible terrain, through impossible seasons, and into this impossible moment. She recognized the handwriting on the front of the envelope immediately. It was her own. "Where did you get that?" Her voice came out barely above a whisper, but in the silence of the empty store it sounded like a gunshot. Clarence Sullivan stood across the counter from her, all 6 feet and 3 inches of him, his dark beard longer than it had been the last time she saw him, his gray eyes steady and unreadable beneath the brim of a hat that had seen better years. He was thinner than she remembered. Harder, like the mountains themselves had carved away everything soft and left only bedrock. "You know where I got it," he said quietly. She shook her head, and the motion was involuntary, a reflexive denial of something she was not yet ready to face. The letter. She had written that letter on a freezing February morning 2 years ago, sitting at this very counter, pouring every secret and every piece of her fractured heart onto a single piece of paper, sealing it with shaking hands, and then sending it with Thomas Beaumont when he rode north toward the high country. She had addressed it to a man she believed she would never see again. A man she had convinced herself did not deserve to know the truth about what she felt for him. A man she had spent 2 years trying to forget. Now that man was standing in front of her, and the letter, her darkest confession, her most forbidden declaration, was lying between them on the counter like an accusation. Thomas never delivered it, she said, because she needed to say something, needed to anchor herself to some reality she could control. Thomas Beaumont died on the south ridge of Pikes Peak in the spring of 1880, Clarence said. Avalanche. I found his body when the snow melted. The letter was inside his coat. He paused, and something moved behind his gray eyes that she could not quite name. "I recognized your handwriting." Lavinia pressed both hands flat on the counter to keep them from shaking. "Did you read it?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "I read it." The silence that followed was the longest silence of her life. Outside, Redemption Creek went about its noisy business, a horse whinnying somewhere down the street, the distant hammer of the blacksmith, a child shouting, and inside this store the whole world had narrowed down to 2 people and a letter and 2 years of secrets pressing against the walls like a flood behind a dam. "Then you know," she said at last. "Then I know," he agreed. She turned away from him because she could not look at him when she said the next thing. She walked to the window that looked out onto the main street of Redemption Creek and stared out at the dust and the sun and the ordinary life of a frontier town in the summer of 1882, and tried to remember how to breathe like a woman who had not just been found out. "What are you going to do with that information?" she asked the window. She heard him move. She heard his boots on the plank floor, slow and deliberate, and the sound of him coming around the counter toward her made her heart do something violent and complicated inside her chest. "That depends," he said, and his voice was very close now, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him at her back, "on what you're going to do now that I'm standing here." She turned around, and he was right there, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to look at his face, and what she saw there dismantled every carefully constructed wall she had built over the past 2 years. He was looking at her like the letter had answered a question that had been destroying him from the inside. But before we can understand what the letter said, we need to go back to where this story truly began, back to the winter before the letter, back to the beginning of everything between Lavinia Talmadge and Clarence Sullivan, back to when the world was cold and the danger was real, and neither of them knew yet how profoundly their lives were about to change. Redemption Creek in the winter of 1879 was not a place that inspired hope. It was a raw, scraped-together collection of buildings huddled at the base of the Colorado Rockies, as if seeking shelter from the enormity of the wilderness, pressing down on it from all sides. The population hovered somewhere around 300 souls on a good day, and those souls were a rough-edged assortment of miners, ranchers, drifters, and a handful of stubborn families who had convinced themselves that civilization was just around the corner if you held on long enough. Lavinia Talmadge had arrived in Redemption Creek 4 years prior, in the autumn of 1875, with her father Elias Talmadge, who had been full of plans and optimism, and a modest inheritance from his brother in Ohio. Elias had opened the general store Talmadge Dry Goods and Provisions, and for 2 years it had seemed like maybe the optimism was justified. Then Elias had developed the cough, and the cough had become something worse, and by the winter of 1877, Lavinia had found herself at 23 years old running a general store alone in a frontier town with a father slowly dying in the back room and no family within 800 miles to call on for help. She was 27 when Clarence Sullivan first walked into her store. He came in on a Tuesday in early December of 1879, and the bell above the door announced him with its usual cheerful ring that seemed absurd given the circumstances, because the circumstances were that it was 17 degrees outside, and the man who walked in through the door was covered in enough snow and ice to suggest he had walked directly out of the mountains rather than down from them, which as it turned out was more or less the truth. Lavinia was behind the counter tallying inventory when he came in, and she looked up expecting one of the regular faces, and instead she saw a stranger. He was tall, as she said, and broad, with the particular kind of physical solidity that comes not from vanity, but from sustained hard labor in a demanding environment. He was perhaps 30, perhaps 32, with dark hair that wanted cutting and a beard that had given up on being shaped, and a pair of eyes so gray and direct that she felt immediately and unreasonably exposed when they landed on her. "Afternoon," he said, his voice carrying the low, careful quality of a man who did not spend a great deal of time talking. "Afternoon," she replied, and set down her pencil with the composure of a woman who had dealt with every variety of the frontier's humanity over 4 years of running a store alone. "You look like you walked from the ridge." "Little south of the ridge," he said, brushing snow from his shoulders. "Cabin at the east face of the Sangre de Cristo approach. I don't come down much in winter, but I needed supplies." She began assembling what she knew mountain men needed in December: flour, dried beans, salt pork, coffee, lamp oil, and he watched her work with an attentiveness that she noted without acknowledging. "You're new," she said. It was not a question. She knew everyone in Redemption Creek and its immediate surroundings. She had never seen this man before. "Moved up in the spring," he said. "Clarence Sullivan, I'm trapping mostly, some prospecting." "Lavinia Talmadge," she said, "this is my store." "I know," he said. "Old Hector at the saloon told me to come here, said you were honest about your weights and fair about your prices." "High praise from Hector," she said dryly. "That man has not trusted a single person in 30 years. The ghost of something that was not quite a smile passed over Clarence Sullivan's face. "He trusts you," he said. She met his eyes for a moment, and there was something there, something quiet and interested and careful, and she filed it away in the back of her mind where she kept things she could not yet account for and returned to totaling his supplies. He paid in coin, which was better than the credit half the town ran on, and he loaded his purchases onto a pack mule he had tied outside, and he tipped his hat to her before he rode back up the mountain, and that was the whole of it. That was the first time. He came back in February. The town had been locked down by a blizzard for 11 days, and the morning it broke, and the sky turned its cold, brilliant post-storm blue. Lavinia was shoveling the walk in front of the store when she heard hooves and looked up to see Clarence Sullivan coming down the main street on a grulla horse with his pack mule behind him. He was moving at a pace that suggested urgency, And when he pulled up in front of the store, his face had something in it that was harder and more complicated than the neutral expression she remembered from December. "Mrs. Talmadge," he said, swinging down. "Talmadge," she corrected, because she had learned early that there was no point in letting assumptions stand unchallenged in a town full of men. "What's happened?" "Man named Jonas Pike has a claim on the South Creek. I think someone's been working his claim while he was pinned by the blizzard. I came across evidence on the way down. Pike lives alone, and I don't know him well enough to be certain he doesn't have a partner, but the sign I saw looked like unauthorized work. He comes in here, I understand." "He does," she said carefully. "He doesn't have a partner." Clarence nodded, and his jaw set in a way that told her this was not idle gossip. "Somebody needs to get word to the sheriff before those men clear out. I'd go myself, but I don't know the sheriff, and I didn't want to ride in there making accusations on behalf of a man I barely know. Thought you might know who to talk to." She looked at him for a moment. He had ridden down from the mountain in the immediate aftermath of an 11-day blizzard to prevent a crime against a man he barely knew. That told her a great deal. "Sheriff Ardell Hatch," she said. "His office is 3 buildings down on the left. Tell him I sent you and tell him everything you told me. He knows Jonas Pike." Clarence nodded and remounted, and she watched him ride down the street with the purposeful efficiency of a man who did not waste motion. And she went back inside and resumed her inventory and told herself there was absolutely nothing particularly noteworthy about a man who did the right thing when he had the opportunity to simply ride on. It happened that the men working Jonas Pike's claim were caught that same afternoon, 2 drifters from Pueblo who had been watching the blizzard as an opportunity. Sheriff Hatch recovered most of Jonas's equipment and the modest amount of gold they had pulled from the creek, and Jonas Pike came into Lavinia's store the next morning and bought the finest bottle of whiskey she carried and said, "That mountain man saved my livelihood. I don't even know his name." "Clarence Sullivan," she said. "Well," said Jonas Pike, "if you see him before I do, tell him Jonas Pike is in his debt." She told Clarence when he came back in March, and he received the information with a slight embarrassed discomfort that she found unexpectedly endearing. "I just reported what I saw," he said. "That's not anything special." "In my experience," Lavinia said, "it is." They looked at each other for a moment across the counter, and that thing she had filed away in the back of her mind in December stirred and rearranged itself into something she could no longer ignore so easily. He began coming down from the mountain more often than strictly necessary for supplies. In April, it was once every 3 weeks. By May, it was twice a month. She told herself this was ordinary commerce, that the store served a practical function in his life, and there was no other significance to read into the regularity of his visits, and she might have gone on telling herself this if not for the afternoon in June when she broke her arm. It was a stupid accident, the kind that happens when you are trying to do too many things at once. She was climbing the ladder to the high shelves to bring down a crate of canned goods for a customer when the ladder shifted on the uneven floor, and she went down, catching herself badly, and the crack of the bone was audible and the pain was immediate and ferocious. The customer, old Martha Bigelow, who was 70 and weighed perhaps 100 pounds, fluttered with helpless alarm and ran out to get help. And the help that arrived, after a brief and painful interval, was Clarence Sullivan, who happened to be at the feed store 2 doors down when Martha appeared in the street calling for assistance. He came in and saw her sitting on the floor with her arm at a wrong angle, and his face went through several expressions very quickly before settling into a calm that she later realized was the deliberate kind, the kind a person assumes when they want the hurt person to stay calm. "I need to get you to Doc Prescott," he said, crouching down to her level, and his voice was very steady. "Can you stand if I help you?" "I can stand on my own," she said through her teeth, because she had been managing on her own for 6 years and pain did not change the arithmetic of that. "I know you can," he said, with a gentleness that cut right through her reflexive independence. "But you don't have to right now." Something in the way he said it made her throat close unexpectedly. She let him help her up. Dr. Harold Prescott set the bone and splinted the arm and told her she would be unable to do heavy work for 6 weeks. She received this news with the grim practicality of a woman who understood that there was no one else to do the heavy work, and that it therefore simply had to be done anyway. And she said as much. And Doc Prescott said he would see what he could arrange. What was arranged, without her being consulted, was that Clarence Sullivan delayed his return to the mountain by 3 days and spent those 3 days doing every physical task the store required. He moved crates and stocked shelves and hauled deliveries, and did it all with the same quiet efficiency that characterized everything he did. And he did not make a production of it or offer unsolicited commentary on her situation. And he turned down the wages she tried to press on him with a brief, absolute refusal. "This isn't a debt situation," he said on the 3rd evening, when he had finished the last of the heavy restocking, and she was sitting behind the counter with her splinted arm resting on the counter between them. "I'm just being a decent neighbor." "You live 2 hours up the mountain," she said. "That stretches the definition of neighbor." "I don't have a lot of neighbors," he said. "Maybe that's why I take the definition seriously." She studied him for a long moment in the amber light of the oil lamp. He was sitting on the barrel she kept near the counter for customers who wanted to linger, his hat on his knee, and he looked, she thought, like a man who was more comfortable in this unremarkable store than he had any particular reason to be, and she had been honest enough with herself over the years to know what that meant. "Why do you come down so often?" she asked. "You came down every few months over winter. Now it's twice a month or more. You don't need that many supplies." The question was blunt, and she watched it land. He held her gaze for a moment, and he was not a man who looked away from things. "No," he said, "I don't." The silence that followed was the kind that has a weight and a texture to it, the kind that is not empty at all but rather full of things that have been said without words. "I should close up," she said at last, because she was not ready. She was not ready for what that silence contained, and she was not ready for what it might mean to be ready, not with a store to run alone, and a life that had been carefully organized around not needing anything she could not provide herself. He stood and put on his hat and said good night, and he rode back up the mountain the following morning, and Lavinia Talmadge sat behind her counter and admitted to herself, in the quiet and private space of her own heart, that she was in a great deal of trouble. The summer of 1880 was when everything complicated itself beyond easy management. There was a man named Doyle Hargrave in Redemption Creek that summer, and Doyle Hargrave was trouble of the most dangerous kind. The kind that wears a pleasant face and carries legitimate-looking papers and explains itself in reasonable tones that make doubt feel like ignorance. He had arrived in town in May presenting himself as a land surveyor working on behalf of a Denver investment group that was interested in the mining rights along the South Creek corridor, and for the first weeks he was nothing more than another unfamiliar face conducting ordinary frontier business. Then the threats started. They were subtle at first. A mention over the counter when he bought his supplies that it would be a shame if such a successful little enterprise were to run into difficulties. A remark about fire risks in dry seasons. Nothing explicit. Nothing that could be taken directly to Sheriff Hatch and called a threat. But Lavinia had been running her store alone for long enough to know exactly what she was hearing, and what she was hearing was that Doyle Hargrave wanted her building, which sat on a corner lot that was suddenly valuable given the proposed mining expansion, and he was prepared to be unpleasant about getting it. She said nothing to Clarence when he came down in early June. She had her reasons, and they were the complicated kind that had to do with pride, and with the particular loneliness of having managed alone for so long that asking for help had become something her system rejected on instinct. But Redemption Creek was a small town, and small towns have no secrets, and the second time Hargrave came into the store and made his veiled suggestions within earshot of 2 other customers, word got around, and word reached the mountain, and one morning in late June, Lavinia looked up from her accounts to find Clarence Sullivan standing in the doorway of her store at 7 in the morning, with an expression on his face that she had not seen before. He was angry. Not the hot, explosive kind of angry that she had seen on plenty of frontier men, but the cold, quiet, steady kind that is considerably more alarming. "Tell me about Doyle Hargrave," he said. "Good morning to you too," she said. "Lavinia," he said her name with a careful, controlled force that made her set down her pen. "I heard things in town last night. Tell me," she told him. All of it, including the parts she had minimized in her own accounting of the situation. When she finished, the cold steadiness in his expression had deepened into something that made the air in the room feel different. "He has no legal claim to your building," Clarence said. "He doesn't need a legal claim if he frightens me out of it," she said. "That's what he's banking on." "He's banking on you having no one to stand behind you," Clarence said, and there was something in the way he said it, the phrasing of it, that made the hair on the back of her neck rise very slightly. "Does he know you're not alone?" She looked at him across the counter. "I am alone," she said quietly. "No," Clarence said, "you're not." The three words hung in the store between them, and they were simple, and they were not simple at all. And Lavinia felt the careful distance she maintained around herself, the necessary, practical, protective distance, develop a crack. What followed over the next several weeks was a careful, deliberate campaign conducted by Clarence Sullivan, and, somewhat to her surprise, by Sheriff Ardell Hatch, who had been waiting for a sufficient reason to look more closely at Doyle Hargrave's operations. The Denver investment group Hargrave claimed to represent turned out, upon the kind of inquiry that a letter to the Denver City Records office could satisfy, to be a paper construction that did not correspond to any legitimate registered business. The papers Hargrave carried were carefully made forgeries. Hargrave was arrested in late July of 1880 and transferred to Denver to face charges of fraud and extortion that involved not only Lavinia's store but several other properties along the creek corridor. He was convicted and sentenced in the autumn, and the threat was over, and Redemption Creek resumed its ordinary noise and business, as if the whole episode had been nothing more than a summer disruption. But for Lavinia and Clarence, the summer had done something irreversible. In fighting for her store, in standing beside her without being asked, and without demanding anything in return, in being simply and completely present in the way that she had not had anyone be present for her in more years than she liked to count, Clarence Sullivan had moved through every wall she had constructed and arrived at the center of something she could no longer pretend was simple. She was in love with him. She had probably been moving toward it since December, since the first time those gray eyes had met hers across the counter, and something had shifted in her chest like a key turning in a lock. But the summer of 1880 had made it undeniable, and there was the problem. Because Clarence Sullivan was a mountain man, and mountain men were not by nature permanent, and she had watched enough men come through Redemption Creek over 4 years to know that the ones who belonged to the wilderness did not belong to towns, and she had built her life in this town, and she was not going to uproot it for a feeling, no matter how large and insistent that feeling had become. She had also noticed, with the particular acuity of a woman paying careful attention to something she was trying not to pay attention to, that Clarence had never said anything direct. He had been present and protective and attentive and warm in the ways that mattered, but he had not put words to it, and she could not know if this was because he felt the same way and was uncertain how she would receive it, or because what he felt was the genuine fondness of a man for a woman he admired in a neighborly sort of way, and he would be baffled and possibly horrified to know the construction she had put upon it. These thoughts occupied a great deal of her interior life in the weeks after Hargrave was removed from the picture, and in this state of internal confusion and suppressed feeling and a longing so large it frightened her, she made a decision. She would not ask. She would not say. She would close the door on this particular room in her heart, and she would find a way to be content with his friendship and the store and the town, and all the ordinary good things her life already contained. She arrived at this decision in the middle of August, and it held for approximately 2 weeks, which was the duration of time between his July visit and his return in late August. He came back with a reason she had not anticipated. He came back to tell her he was going higher. "I've found a promising vein on the northeast face," he told her, leaning on the counter with that ease he had developed in her store, the ease of a man who had come to think of a place as his. "It's going to take most of the fall and winter to work it properly. I won't be able to come down much." Lavinia heard this and experienced several things simultaneously. The recognition that this was the natural consequence of his life and his work, and she had known it was coming. And underneath that, like a current under still water, a grief that was entirely disproportionate to the simple announcement that a customer would be visiting less often. "I'll set aside supplies you can collect in a single visit before the cold sets in," she said, because that was the practical, sensible, appropriate thing to say. "I'd appreciate that," he said. He lingered longer than necessary that afternoon. He sat on the barrel and they talked about the town and the mining season, and the coming winter and various small things that meant nothing in themselves but accumulated, as conversations with him always did, into something that felt significant and complete. And when he finally stood to go, he looked at her for a moment with those gray eyes in a way that made her heart do something desperate and foolish. And then he said good night, and that was the last time she saw him clearly for the better part of 2 years. He did come down in October once to collect the supplies she had set aside. Their time together was brief and occupied with the practical business of loading his mule, and he was quieter than usual, turned somewhat inward, the way men get when they are preparing for the long solitude of a mountain winter, and she was quieter than usual too, for reasons she kept carefully interior. She had made her decision. She would not complicate his life with things she felt. He was what he was and she was what she was, and that was simply the truth of it. But decisions made in the rational mind do not always govern the heart, and the heart, as it happened, had other plans. She wrote the letter on a morning in February of 1880, during the kind of winter that makes people do things they would not otherwise do, when the cold has been unrelenting for weeks, and the isolation has its own particular pressure, and the ordinary defenses of common sense feel thin and insufficient. She sat down at the counter before the store opened, and she took out paper, and she wrote to him. She told him the truth. She told him all of it, the things she had been refusing to say since December of the year before, the things she had been managing and suppressing and reasoning away for months. She told him that she was in love with him. She told him that she had been moving toward it from the very beginning, and that she understood perfectly well if it was not reciprocal, and that she was not writing to make demands or create obligations, only because the weight of carrying it alone through the winter had become more than she could manage, and she needed to put it somewhere outside herself, even if the letter never reached him, even if he never read it. She sealed it and addressed it to Clarence Sullivan, East Face Camp, Sangre de Cristo approach, and she told herself she would think carefully before sending it. She would sleep on it. She would give herself time to decide if this was wisdom or weakness. Thomas Beaumont came in that afternoon to buy tobacco and mentioned he was riding north toward the high country and would pass close to the East Face approach, and she could hear her own father's voice in her head saying, "Now or never, Lavinia, now or never." And before she could talk herself out of it, she pressed the letter into Thomas Beaumont's hand and asked him to deliver it if he happened to come close to the Sullivan camp. Thomas Beaumont nodded cheerfully and tucked the letter in his coat and rode out of Redemption Creek that afternoon, and Lavinia spent the following days in a state of alternating terror and strange relief, waiting for a response that would either remake everything or confirm that she had made a catastrophic mistake. The response never came. Weeks passed. March arrived. April. The mountain showed no sign of releasing Clarence Sullivan. She told herself the letter had not reached him. She told herself Thomas had found the route impassable and would deliver it in the spring. She told herself 100 things, and underneath all of them, the smaller and harder truth. She had said the words and they had gone out into the wilderness and been swallowed. And now, she had to live with that and move on. By summer, she had mostly achieved the outward appearance of having moved on. The store was busy, the season was good, and Lavinia Talmadge was known in Redemption Creek as a competent, self-sufficient woman who ran a fair business and kept her own counsel and did not require anything from anybody. It was later that same summer, in August of 1880, that word came from a trapper named Hugh Culver that Thomas Beaumont had been caught in an avalanche on the south ridge of Pikes Peak in late April and had not survived. His body had been found when the snow cleared. The news settled over Lavinia with a quiet, particular weight. Thomas Beaumont had been a good man, if not one she knew well, and his death was a genuine loss. And the letter, she understood, was gone with him. She recalibrated accordingly. The letter had never been delivered. It was buried in snow and would disintegrate in the summer melt, and that was the end of it. What she had felt was real, but it was private, and it would remain private. And Clarence Sullivan would come back down from the mountain in the autumn, and she would be exactly the same as she had always been, and this particular chapter would close without drama and without consequence. That autumn she waited for him to come down, and he did not. She heard from Hugh Culver, who passed through the area regularly, that the Sullivan camp was active, that the vein he had found was producing well, that he had built a better shelter and settled in for a long, productive season. Hugh Culver mentioned this with the casual admiration of one wilderness man for another, without any awareness that this information might land differently on someone else. Lavinia received the news and adjusted her expectations and went on. The following year, 1881, he came down once in the spring in March, when she had not been expecting him. It was a brief visit, the kind that happens when a man has been alone in the mountains for 5 months and needs to be in the company of other people for a day before the need embarrasses him. And he was different in some way she could not precisely name, a little more remote, a little more contained. But his eyes, when they met hers, were the same, had that same quality of focused attention that had always made her feel seen in a way that was both welcome and alarming. She said nothing about the letter. He had not received it. There was nothing to say. He went back up in late March of 1881. He came down once more in October of 1881, loaded up supplies for winter, and that visit too was brief and practical, and underneath its surface, freighted with the particular suppressed tension of two people who are both maintaining a necessary silence that neither can fully explain to themselves. And then the winter of 1881 to 1882 went by, and the spring of 1882 arrived, and July came with its heat and its noise, and one afternoon Lavinia was standing behind the counter of her store tallying inventory when the bell above the door rang, and she looked up expecting one of the regular faces, and instead she saw Clarence Sullivan. And on the counter between them he set down a letter. Her letter. So now here they were, standing close together in the amber light of the afternoon coming through the store's front window, the letter between them and 2 years of silence and distance, and suppressed feeling pressing in from all sides. Say what you need to say, Lavinia told him, because she had learned over the years that it was better to receive things directly and without delay. Whatever you came here to say, just say it. Clarence Sullivan looked at her for a long moment, and she could see the cost of whatever this was. She could see that he had come down from the mountain with something large and heavy he had been carrying for a long time, and she thought that it had probably not been easier for him than for her. The things people do not say have a weight that accumulates like snowpack on a mountain slope, pressing down and down until something gives. I read your letter in the spring of 1880, he said. When I found Thomas, I read it and then I held it for 3 weeks before I could think clearly enough to do anything at all. He stopped, and she could see him locating the words with the care of a man who does not speak casually. I thought about coming down immediately. I thought about it a great deal. But you didn't, she said. But I didn't, he agreed. Because what you wrote in that letter, what you told me, I needed to be worthy of it, Lavinia, and I was not certain I was. I've been a man of the wilderness for a long time, and I have reasons for that which are not pretty, and I did not want to come down to you carrying all of those reasons and offer them in exchange for something as valuable as what was in that letter. She was very still, listening. I have a dark past, he said, and the words were deliberate and unhidden, offered without defense. I told you I came here to trap and prospect, and that is true, but it is not the whole truth. I came here because I needed to be somewhere that I could not hurt anyone else with my failures. I had a life in Missouri before this, a life that I destroyed through my own choices, through arrogance and carelessness, and a refusal to understand until it was too late what mattered. I lost someone because of it, not to death, but to my own inadequacy. And I came out here and I went up into those mountains and I told myself I would stay up there until I had rebuilt something worth bringing back down. Lavinia stood very still and let this settle. She had known he had a history she did not know. Everyone who came out to the frontier had a history that preceded them, often for good reasons. She had not asked because she had not felt it was her place to ask, and because some part of her had been afraid of what the asking might reveal. What happened? She said quietly. In Missouri, he told her. It took a while and it was not a comfortable telling. He had been a young man in a hurry, talented and ambitious and insufficiently patient with anyone who could not keep up with his pace, including the woman he had been engaged to marry. He had prioritized his own ambitions over her needs in a sustained and systematic way that he had been too self-absorbed at the time to recognize as the pattern of damage it was. By the time she left him, the damage was done and she was right to go and he knew it. But knowing it had not made it easier to absorb, and the absorption had taken him west and up into the mountains, and into the solitude that had eventually done what he had hoped it would, which was strip away the arrogance and leave behind something more honest and more careful. I spent 2 years up there after I found your letter, he said, being certain. Being sure that what I felt when I read it was the real thing and not just loneliness, which can counterfeit the real thing convincingly enough to deceive anyone. He looked at her steadily. It's the real thing, Lavinia. It was the real thing from the day I walked into this store the first time, and you looked up from your accounts like I was just another item to be recorded, and I thought, this woman sees right through things. I want her to see through me. Lavinia exhaled slowly. The feeling in her chest was large and complicated and entirely wonderful, and she was also a practical woman who had been managing practical realities for a long time, and she could not simply set that down in an instant. I need to ask you something, she said. Ask. The mountains, she said. Your cabin, the work up there, is that something you're prepared to leave? He was quiet for a moment. I'm not a man who needs the wilderness, he said carefully. I'm a man who used the wilderness to fix something that needed fixing. What I am now, what I've built myself into up there, that's portable. I can be that man here in this town, in this life, as easily as I can be it on the east face of the Sangre de Cristo. He paused. Easier, probably, because you would be here. She held his gaze for a long moment, reading everything she could read there, and what she found was the same thing she had been finding for 3 years. A man who was honest and steady and careful and deep, and who looked at her with the specific attention of someone to whom she mattered. I need you to understand what you're choosing, she said, because she could not let him come into this blind and have him discover it later and find it insufficient. This store is my life. It's the life my father built, and I have kept it running, and I intend to keep it running for the foreseeable future. I am not looking to be taken care of. I am looking for a partner if I am looking for anything at all. I understand that, he said, and there was not a trace of resistance in it, only a quiet alignment, as if she had described something he had already accepted and agreed with. Then, she said, and had to stop and breathe and start again. then I think you should know that what I wrote in that letter is still true, every word of it. 2 years didn't change any of it. I tried to make it change and it refused. Clarence Sullivan reached across the counter and took her hand carefully, the way he did everything with deliberateness and intention, and the kind of consideration that she had learned to recognize as his natural mode of existing in the world. "I know," he said softly. "That's why I came down." The days that followed were not dramatic in the conventional sense. They were something better. They were real. Clarence took a room at the boarding house run by widow Frances Garrett on the east side of town, which was a practical arrangement and also a statement. Because in a town the size of Redemption Creek, a man does not take a room at the boarding house if he intends to be passing through. And the town understood this immediately and processed it with the particular focused interest of a community that has been watching two people orbit each other for years and is both delighted and slightly smug about the outcome. He came to the store every day, and some days he helped with the heavy work the way he had when her arm was broken, and other days he simply sat on the barrel near the counter and they talked, and the talking was different now. It had the particular quality of two people who have been very careful for a long time finally allowing themselves to be somewhat less careful. And it was wonderful in the way that the particular removal of a particular burden is wonderful, not flashy, but deep and permeating and utterly sufficient. He told her more about Missouri, piece by piece, not all at once. She told him about her father, about the years of caring for him while running the store, about the particular loneliness of a life defined by work and responsibility, and the absence of anyone to simply be with. He listened to all of it with the same attentiveness he brought to everything, and she had the repeated experience over those weeks of feeling not just heard but understood, which was a different and rarer thing. One evening in late July, about 3 weeks after he had come down from the mountain, they were sitting on the bench outside the store watching the sky go from blue to orange to the deep blue-black of a Colorado summer night, and Clarence said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that the answer is not going to change anything about how things are right now, because I think right now is already more than I had any reasonable expectation of." She looked at him sideways. "That is a great deal of preparation for a question." "It's an important question," he said. She waited. "I would like to marry you," he said, "not as a claim or a management, but as a commitment. I'd like to belong to your life the way you already belong to mine, and I would like for that to be official and stated and known. But I understand if you need more time, or if you're not certain, or if the idea of marrying someone with my history is something you need to think carefully about." Lavinia looked at the darkening sky above Redemption Creek for a long moment. She thought about the letter she had written on a winter morning when the cold was pressing down, and she had finally told the truth. She thought about the 2 years that letter had spent inside a dead man's coat on the slope of Pikes Peak. She thought about Clarence Sullivan carrying it down from the mountain and walking through her door and setting it on her counter, and what it had taken for him to do that, and what it meant that he had. "Clarence," she said. "Yes, I would like that too," she said. He let out a long, slow breath, and she could feel the weight going out of him. And she turned to look at him, and he was looking at her with something on his face that was so open and undefended that it undid her completely. And she stopped trying to be measured and practical and simply leaned into him, and he put his arm around her. And they sat on the bench in front of Talmadge, dry goods and provisions in the gathering dark of a summer evening in Redemption Creek, Colorado. And the town moved around them at its ordinary pace, and none of it was grand or theatrical, and all of it was exactly right. They were married in September of 1882, on a Saturday afternoon, in the small white church at the north end of Main Street that Reverend Jeremiah Dodd had been trying to fill every Sunday for 4 years with varying success. It was not a large wedding by any standard, but it was well attended because, in a small town, the wedding of a woman who has been a known and respected figure for 7 years is not a minor event, and because There was a general sense among the people of Redemption Creek that this particular marriage had been visibly and patiently accruing for years, and it was gratifying to see it arrive at its destination. Frances Garrett, at whose boarding house Clarence had been living, made it her personal mission to ensure the reception was worthy of the occasion, and organized a supper in the church hall with contributions from half the town. And Jonas Pike, who had never forgotten what Clarence had done for him 2 winters ago, showed up with a bottle of the best bourbon he had been saving since his claim started producing and gave a toast that was short, sincere, and slightly too loud. Sheriff Ardell Hatch shook Clarence's hand and told him he was the best addition to Redemption Creek since the railroad extended to within a day's ride, which was Sheriff Hatch's version of a deeply felt compliment. Lavinia wore a dress she had ordered from Denver 6 weeks prior, a deep blue with ivory trim, and she wore her dark hair pinned up with the pearl pins her mother had left her, and she stood beside Clarence Sullivan in front of Reverend Dodd and said her vows in a clear, steady voice. And when he slid the ring onto her finger, a plain gold band he had chosen from the jeweler in the next town over after 3 trips and considerable deliberation, she felt something settle in her chest that she realized had been unsettled for a very long time. After the ceremony and the supper and the well-wishes, they walked home through the warm September night to the house that Clarence had been working on since August, a house 3 lots down from the store that had been a dilapidated claim office, and was now, after 2 months of determined reconstruction, a real home with a real kitchen and a bedroom, and a parlor with 2 chairs facing the fireplace and a window that looked up toward the mountains. "It's not finished," Clarence said, as they stood in the front room by the light of a single oil lamp, looking at the parlor with its freshly plastered walls and its recently laid floor. "There are things that still need doing." "It doesn't need to be finished to be home," Lavinia said. He looked at her and she looked at him, and 2 years of letters and mountains and silence and secrets had led to this exact room and this exact moment, and it was enough. It was more than enough. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was the best winter Lavinia Talmadge Sullivan had ever known in Redemption Creek. There was the work of the store, which continued as always, and there was the continuing work on the house, and there were long evenings by the fireplace and early mornings with coffee and conversations that ranged from the entirely practical to the deeply felt. There was the particular pleasure of becoming fully known to another person, all the ordinary daily habits and preferences and irritations and joys, which is the intimate architecture that formal love declarations only gesture toward. Clarence proved to be, as she had expected, a man of genuine capability in the physical world. He had skills she had not anticipated. He could build and repair things with a competence born of years of necessity. He was an excellent cook in the particular way that men who have fed themselves alone in the wilderness become excellent cooks, and he had a patience with difficulty and setback that she found both impressive and, on the occasions when she herself was not being patient, mildly irritating and also deeply stabilizing. She proved to be, she suspected, occasionally difficult to live with in ways she had not fully accounted for, having been entirely self-directed for so long that the accommodation of another person's rhythms and preferences and needs sometimes required conscious effort. But Clarence was not a man who required her to be different. He was a man who was interested in who she actually was, which was a thing she had not fully understood the value of until she had it. In the spring of 1883, she discovered she was pregnant. She told Clarence on a Sunday morning, sitting at the kitchen table over coffee, with the matter-of-fact delivery of a woman who has processed her own news carefully before presenting it to anyone else. He went very still for a moment, and then he looked at her with an expression of such unguarded joy that she had to look down at her coffee cup to manage her own response to it. "Are you well?" he asked, the practical concern immediate and characteristic. "Perfectly," she said. "Doc Prescott confirms the same. November, he thinks." Clarence reached across the table and took her hand, and he held it without saying anything for a long moment, and she could feel through his hand what the news meant to him, and it moved her. "We should expand the house," he said at last, which was so fundamentally Clarence the immediate translation of feeling into constructive action, that she laughed, and the laugh turned into something slightly more emotional than she intended, and he moved his chair next to hers and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they sat there in the spring morning light of their kitchen in Redemption Creek, and the future arranged itself ahead of them like the best possible kind of country, full of difficulty and work and weather and uncertainty, and also full of this warmth, this partnership, this absolute and complete sense of being exactly where she was supposed to be. The summer of 1883 brought changes to Redemption Creek beyond the personal. The railroad that had been edging toward the area for 2 years finally committed to a route that would bring a spur line within 12 miles of town, which meant that by 1884 the geography of commerce would be different. Goods would move faster and cheaper, and the town itself was likely to grow. This was a matter of considerable civic discussion and some anxiety among the established businesses, who were unsure whether growth meant opportunity or competition. Lavinia was pragmatic about it. She had been in Redemption Creek long enough to have seen the town change several times, and she knew that the businesses which survived change were the ones with genuine community relationships, the ones that people came to not just for goods, but for the familiarity and trust that accumulated over years of fair dealing. Talmadge Dry Goods and Provisions. She had kept her family name in the store name, and Clarence had never suggested otherwise, had those relationships in abundance. Clarence, for his part, had been thinking about the mining claim he still held on the east face of the Sangre de Cristo. The vein he had worked was not yet exhausted, and over the summer he made several trips up to assess it, always returning within a week, never staying long, and Lavinia noted each time with the private pleasure of someone who has been given consistent evidence of a thing they value that he always came back looking glad to be back, and that the gladness was real. In August, he brought down the last of his equipment from the mountain camp and consolidated it in the storage shed behind their house, and the camp on the east face was officially abandoned. He did not make a formal announcement of this. He simply did it efficiently and without ceremony, and when she asked him if he was certain, he said yes in the tone of a man for whom the matter had been settled for some time. "What about the vein?" she asked. "I've registered the claim," he said. "I'll work it in short seasons, maybe hire a man or two eventually, but I'm not going back up to live." He looked at her steadily. "I live here." The simplicity of it was its own form of eloquence. Their son was born on the 3rd of November, 1883, in the bedroom of the expanded house during a snowstorm that kept Doc Prescott partially distracted by worries about getting to the outlying ranches, but did not prevent him from being fully present for the Sullivan birth. The labor was long and difficult, and Clarence spent most of it in the adjacent room being quietly but visibly tormented by his inability to do anything useful about what was happening to his wife. And when Doc Prescott opened the door and told him he had a son, his response was to go into the bedroom immediately and sit beside Lavinia's bed and hold her hand and look at the red, wrinkled, indignant infant in her arms with an expression that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. "He looks angry," Clarence said. "He should be," Lavinia said, exhausted and serene. It was not a comfortable arrival. They named him Elias James Sullivan. Elias for Lavinia's father, James for Clarence's younger brother in Missouri with whom he had been slowly reconstructing a correspondence over the previous year. The two names together felt right to both of them, a bridge between what had been and what was being built. Elias James Sullivan was an emphatic personality from his earliest weeks, which should perhaps not have surprised anyone given his parentage. He had Clarence's gray eyes and Lavinia's dark hair, and an opinion about almost everything he encountered, expressed at considerable volume. He was also, Both parents noted with the slightly stunned gratitude of people who were not certain they had any idea what they were doing. Enormously easy to love. The winter of 1883 to 1884 was demanding in the particular way of winters with a newborn: the interrupted sleep, the sustained alertness, the ongoing renegotiation of all previous routines around the needs of a person of extremely small size and extremely large requirements. Clarence took to fatherhood with the same steady, competent attentiveness he brought to everything, and Lavinia found that this, too, watching him with their son, was among the more quietly transformative things she had experienced. The railroad spur reached its closest point to Redemption Creek in the spring of 1884, and the town did indeed begin to grow. New families arrived over that summer and autumn, drawn by the improved access and the improving infrastructure, and the general sense that this particular corner of Colorado was becoming something more than a rough frontier outpost. A second general store opened in July, run by a family named Morrison who were energetic and not unprofessional, and Lavinia watched this development with the calm attention of someone secure in her own position, while being appropriately realistic about competition. She and Clarence discussed it one evening with the frankness that had become the ordinary tone of their conversations about everything that mattered. "They're going to take some of the trade," she said. "The new families coming in won't have a history with this store. They'll spread their business around." "Then we give them a reason to choose us," Clarence said. "What reason?" He thought for a moment. "You've been here 7 years. You know what this country needs and what the people in it need. Morrisons are new. They're bringing what they brought from wherever they came from. You have what nobody can replicate." He looked at her. "Expertise and trust, that's not a small thing." She nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about expanding the provisions, fresh goods. The railroad makes that viable in a way it wasn't before." "Then do it," he said simply. She did. Over the following year, Talmadge Dry Goods and Provisions evolved into something somewhat larger and more organized, adding a fresh provisions section and a modest postal services desk. Because the nearest post office before the railroad had been a day's ride away, and now that mail was moving more efficiently, there was real demand for a local service point. Clarence built the expansion himself over the late summer, and she found, as she had found with every practical project he undertook, that his work was precise and quietly excellent. The Morrison store, it turned out, was not a threat but a neighbor. Eleanor Morrison, who ran the operational side of her family's business, turned out to be a quick-minded, warmly competent woman who arrived at the same conclusions Lavinia had arrived at years earlier about how to run a frontier business with integrity. And within a year of their parallel operations, the two women had arrived at a natural professional respect that occasionally toppled over into genuine friendship. In the summer of 1885, when Elias was nearly 2 and pulling himself up on every available surface with the cheerful determination of a person whose ambitions significantly exceed his current capabilities, Lavinia discovered she was expecting again. She told Clarence on a Sunday morning, at the kitchen table, over coffee, in the same matter-of-fact way she had told him the first time. He went very still again, and then he smiled at her, and it was the kind of smile that is not at all measured or restrained, and she smiled back, and Elias, from his position on the kitchen floor where he was attempting to defeat a wooden spoon, observed his parents' shared expression with the solemn interest of a person who understands something significant is happening even if the specifics are unclear. Their daughter was born in February of 1886. They named her Clara Josephine Sullivan Clara because Lavinia had loved the name since childhood, Josephine for Frances Garrett, the widow who had run the boarding house where Clarence had first lived when he came down from the mountain, and who had become, over the years, a figure of genuine warmth and importance in both their lives. Frances Garrett, upon learning the middle name, cried and then denied having cried and brought an enormous quantity of food to the Sullivan house for the following 2 weeks. Clara arrived in the world with considerably more grace than her brother had, coming quickly and without undue drama on a February morning, while Elia sat in Francis Garrett's kitchen eating cornbread and being entirely ignorant of the significance of events. And she was from the beginning a different kind of person than Elia's. Quieter, more observant, with Lavinia's intensity concentrated behind a stillness rather than expressed in it. Redemption Creek by 1886 was a different town than the one Lavinia had arrived in 11 years earlier. There were over 800 people now, 2 churches, 3 schools. The third just opened a small newspaper called the Creek Courier, which had been publishing for 2 years, and which Lavinia occasionally contributed to on matters of local commerce and civic interest. The railroad connection had done exactly what it promised, drawing both growth and complication in roughly equal measure. The question of land rights and legal titles, which had always been a rough-edged issue in the frontier West, had become more acute with the increased investment activity in the area, and it was in this context that the shadow of Doyle Hargrave briefly returned, not the man himself. He had served his time and moved on to whatever the next chapter of his life looked like, but the legal questions his attempted fraud had raised. The property records for several lots along the creek corridor were, it turned out, tangled enough to require a proper legal review, and Clarence spent a considerable portion of the spring of 1886 in correspondence with the county seat, and eventually with a Denver attorney, ensuring that the deed to both their home and the store property was unambiguously clean and properly recorded. He told her about it one evening after the children were asleep, laying out the correspondence on the kitchen table with the systematic thoroughness he brought to things that required it. "It's resolved," he said, "completely. Both properties are clean. I wanted to be certain before I told you because I didn't want to give you a problem without a solution." She looked at him across the table. "You've been working on this for 3 months. Since February," he confirmed, "without telling me. I didn't want to worry you. You had Clara arriving and the store expansion." "Clarence," she said, and her voice had the particular quality that stopped him mid-sentence. "I am your partner. I do not need to be protected from problems. I need to face them with you." He held her gaze and she could see him absorbing this, receiving it not defensively but genuinely. "You're right," he said. "I'm sorry. It's an old habit. The impulse to manage things alone before they become a shared burden." "I know," she said, because she had the same impulse, had fought it for years, recognized it for exactly what it was. "We can both work on that." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Yes," he said. The acknowledgement, simple as it was, mattered. This was the texture of their marriage in its day-to-day reality. Not just the warmth and the love and the shared life, but the ongoing, honest work of 2 people who had both spent years alone and had to deliberately, consciously choose partnership every time the old reflexes pushed them towards self-sufficiency. It was work worth doing, and they both knew it. By the autumn of 1886, Clarence had made a decision about the mining claim on the east face. The vein, while not exhausted, had reached a point where the return was no longer justifying the effort of seasonal operation, and he had received an offer from a Denver mining company that was consolidating claims in the area. The offer was fair, genuinely fair, not the extortionate kind that companies sometimes made when they thought they were dealing with someone who did not understand the value of what they held. And he discussed it with Lavinia with all the relevant numbers laid out, and together they decided to accept it. The money from the sale went into the store expansion fund and into a small but real savings account that Lavinia maintained at the bank in the nearest significant town. It was not a fortune, but it was security, the kind that takes the sharper edge off uncertainty, and both of them valued it for exactly that reason. The winter of 1886 to 1887 passed warmly and well. Elia's, 3 years old now, was a remarkable amount of personality in a small body, opinionated and curious and entirely unintimidated by anything or anyone. which occasionally created challenges in public spaces and regularly delighted his parents. Clara, just under a year, was developing the quiet watchfulness that would characterize her from earliest life, and she had a smile that she deployed infrequently, but with devastating precision. Frances Garrett, who had been declining slowly in health since the previous year, died in January of 1887. She was 71 and had been in Redemption Creek for over 20 years, and her death left a genuine hole in the town's fabric, and in Lavinia and Clarence's lives more specifically. The boarding house passed to her nephew, who sold it within 6 months to a family who converted it into a proper hotel, which was perhaps fitting given what the town was becoming. They mourned her in the way that people who are good at loving do, fully, without rushing, giving the grief the space it needed, and letting it find its natural conclusion rather than managing it toward premature resolution. Clarence, who had begun his time in Redemption Creek under her roof, was quieter than usual for several weeks, and Lavinia gave him that space without pressing, and he came back from it with the particular clarity that real grief sometimes leaves behind. "She told me once," he said about a month after the funeral, "that the fact I kept coming down the mountain so often before we were married was obvious to everyone in town for at least a year before anything was said about it." Lavinia raised her eyebrows. "She told you that? She had opinions about timing," he said with the ghost of a smile. "She was right," Lavinia said. "It was obvious." He looked at her. "Was it obvious to you?" "Clarence," she said, "I wrote you a letter." He smiled at that. A full, real smile, and she thought for perhaps the 100th time since that July afternoon in 1882 how entirely and precisely she loved this man. Not the version of him she had constructed in imagination, but the actual complete specific person. The one who came down from mountains with letters and built expansions onto stores and spent 3 months quietly resolving legal problems, and went very still when given the best news and smiled like that when something caught him off guard. In the spring of 1888, Talmadge Dry Goods and Provisions became Sullivan and Talmadge Provisions and Postal Services, the new name reflecting the reality that had existed in practice for years, and also reflecting the expanded postal designation they had formally received from the county. The sign above the door was painted by Jonas Pike's eldest daughter, who had artistic talent she had been quietly developing, and it was considered the finest sign on Main Street by general consensus. Lavinia kept the Talmadge name in the store because her father had built it and it belonged there, and Clarence's name in the sign reflected his 7 years of partnership in the enterprise in every practical sense. The combination felt right. Both histories, both names, carried forward together. Elias, 5 years old, inspected the new sign with the serious assessment of a person who takes signs seriously, and pronounced it good, which his parents received as the authoritative judgment it was. That summer, Lavinia became pregnant for the 3rd time, and the news arrived with the particular mixture of joy and brisk practicality that was by now their established mode for significant developments. The store was well staffed. They had hired Martha Bigelow's granddaughter, a capable 17-year-old named Ruth, 2 years prior, and she had grown into the work beautifully. The house was large enough, the finances were stable, and both children were old enough to be genuinely manageable. "We'll need another cradle," Clarence said. "You can build it," she said. "I was already planning to," he said. The 3rd child arrived in March of 1889, another boy, and they named him Thomas William Sullivan. The Thomas was deliberate. Thomas Beaumont had been a man who had tried to do a kind thing, carrying a letter north toward the mountains, and the avalanche that stopped him had been no fault of his and no reflection on his intentions. Naming a child Thomas felt like a proper acknowledgement of that, a small act of remembrance for a man whose unknowing role in their story had been greater than he could ever have known. Redemption Creek in 1889 was not the Redemption Creek of 1875 in almost any respect. The population had passed 1,200. There was a proper bank, a small hotel, a newspaper with real circulation, 2 doctors, and a school that ran through what passed for secondary education in the frontier West. Colorado itself had been a state for 13 years. The wilderness was not receding. The mountains were still the mountains, the winters still fierce, the land still itself, but the human world pressing against it had grown more organized and more permanent. Lavinia stood outside the store one evening in the late spring of 1889, watching the street in the early evening light, and she thought about the woman who had arrived here 14 years ago with her father and his optimism and a modest inheritance, and she thought about all the years between then and now, and she was conscious of a feeling that she identified, after a moment's consideration, as a deep and genuine satisfaction. Not complacency, not the absence of wishes or ambitions, but the solid, rooted satisfaction of a life that had been built honestly and well, with difficulty and love, and the particular stubborn commitment to doing things right that was her father's gift to her. Clarence came out to stand beside her, the way he often did in the evenings, with the comfortable ease of a man who has long since settled the question of where he belongs. "Elia's got into the cornmeal again," he said. "That child," she said. "He explained to me that he was investigating its properties," Clarence said, "scientifically. He is 6 years old." "He was very convincing," Clarence said, and she could hear the amusement and the pride both present in his voice. She leaned into him slightly, and he shifted his arm around her, and they stood there watching the main street of Redemption Creek in the evening light of a May day in 1889. And she thought about a letter written on a February morning 9 years ago now. A letter that had taken 2 years to arrive and had arrived in the most impossible way. And she thought about what it meant that it had found its way home at all. That through avalanche and 2 years of solitude and a long walk down from the mountains and a moment of enormous courage, it had arrived where it was supposed to go and set in motion everything that followed. "I have been thinking," Clarence said, "about writing to my brother. Asking him to come out for a visit. I think he might like it here." "I think that's a fine idea," she said. "It would be good for the children to know him," he said, "and good for me." He paused. "I've spent too many years keeping my life in separate compartments, the life before and the life after. I'd like to have them be one life." She understood exactly what he meant because she had done the same thing, had kept the before her father, Ohio, the early years separate from the after, as if the division were necessary for the present to function. But the present was strong enough to hold the whole story now. "Write to him," she said. "Tell him to bring his family if he has one." "He married a few years ago," Clarence said. "2 children." "Then tell him to bring all of them," she said. He tightened his arm around her very slightly, and she felt his breath against her hair, and below them Main Street went about its evening business, a cart rattling past, someone calling across the street, the light catching the dust in the air and making it gold. And it was all ordinary and all irreplaceable, and it was hers, fully hers and his and theirs together. The summer of 1889 brought James Sullivan, his wife Margaret, and their 2 daughters to Redemption Creek for a month's visit that extended to 6 weeks, because Margaret declared herself in love with Colorado, and James had not anticipated how much he had missed his brother until he was standing in the kitchen of the Sullivan house on Main Street, watching Clarence read to his son and daughter by lamplight, and felt something heal in him that he had not known was broken. The reunion between the brothers was not uncomplicated. There were years between them and old wounds that required honest attention, but it was real, and the attention that was given to those old wounds had the careful quality that Clarence brought to difficult things, the kind of care that actually works. By the end of the 6 weeks, there was between the 2 Sullivan brothers something that both of them recognized as the foundation of an ongoing real relationship, the kind that is built on truth rather than the fiction of pretended continuity. James's elder daughter, who was 8 and had her father's dark hair and her mother's sharp eyes, and Elia Sullivan, 6, conducted a constant negotiation that was partly rivalry and partly alliance, and entirely absorbing to both of them. And Clara, 3, observed the proceedings with the unmoved philosophical attention that characterized her relationship to most things, and baby Thomas slept through the majority of events with the transcendent indifference available only to the very young. The Sullivans of Missouri returned home in August with promises to write that were kept, and with a standing invitation that would be honored 2 years later when the railroad made the journey easier, and the Redemption Creek contingent made the reverse trip to Missouri. But that is somewhat beyond the immediate story, and needs only a brief gesture toward it to indicate that the thread, once reconnected, was maintained. In the autumn of 1889, Lavinia and Clarence sat at their kitchen table with the household accounts spread between them, the store accounts, the family accounts, the modest investment account at the bank, and looked at where they were and where they might be going, and had the kind of conversation that is only possible between two people who have built something together from the ground up and trust each other completely in their assessment of it. "The store is solid," she said. "More than solid. The postal designation brings in reliable income independent of trade fluctuations, and the new families settling in the area this year." 14 new families between March and now, Clarence said. He kept track of this the way she kept track of inventory, as a matter of practical planning. "Which means the next 5 years look better than the last 5, she said. "Which were already good." He nodded, looking at the numbers. "I want to hire a full-time assistant manager," she said. "Not just Ruth for the floor, someone who can actually manage the operation when I'm not there, someone we can train to know the business properly." "Ruth is ready for more responsibility," Clarence said. "She is," Lavinia agreed. "I was thinking of making her assistant manager formally and hiring a second person for the floor. A man might help with some of the heavier provisioning work." "I can do the heavy work," Clarence said mildly. "You can when you're here," she said. "But you're increasingly not here because the children require a parent on the other side of the equation, and you are excellent at being that parent, and I would like to be able to run the store at full capacity regardless of which of us is where." He looked at her with something warm and amused in his expression. "You've thought this through," he said. "I think everything through," she said. "I know," he said. "It's one of the things I find most reliably impressive about you." She looked at him across the kitchen table. The lamp between them cast its familiar amber light, and outside the October wind was moving down from the mountains with its first hints of the winter to come, and the children were asleep, and the house was warm, and this man was sitting across from her with his honest gray eyes and his considered words, and his whole self offered without reservation, and she felt the gratitude of it with a clarity that she hoped she would never stop feeling. "Clarence," she said. "Yes. Do you ever regret it? Coming down? Staying down?" He did not answer immediately, which was characteristic. He did not answer things before he had the real answer. "No," he said at last. "I miss the particular quality of silence up there sometimes. The way the mountains are at dawn in November. There is nothing else quite like it." He held her gaze. "But everything I want is here. Everything I have built and everything I intend to build. My family is here." He paused. "You are here." She nodded slowly. "And you?" he asked. "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been if you had not sent that letter?" She considered it honestly, because he had asked honestly and he deserved the honest answer. "I wonder what I would have lost," she said. "I wonder how long I would have gone on managing everything alone and telling myself it was sufficient." She looked at him. "The letter was the most frightening thing I had ever done. I nearly didn't send it. If Thomas Beaumont had not walked in when he did, I would probably have burned it. And I would have come back down from the mountain eventually," Clarence said. "But I might not have said anything. I might have told myself I had no right to, given my history." He paused. "We might have spent the rest of our lives being very courteous to each other in your store." "Unbearable," she said. "Completely unbearable," he agreed. They looked at each other, and the absurdity and the gratitude of the whole improbable chain of events, the letter, the avalanche, the 2 years, the walk down from the mountain, were present between them like a shared private joke that was also something much larger and more serious. "Thomas Beaumont," she said. "Thomas Beaumont," he echoed, with the particular gravity that the name had always carried. She looked down at the accounts on the table and then back at him. "Their baby's middle name was well chosen," she said. "Yes," Clarence said quietly, "I thought so too." In the years that followed, Redemption Creek continued its becoming. The last great surge of the old-style frontier was winding down by the early 1890s, the West more settled than it had been, the wildness contracting as the organized world expanded into it, and this brought both gain and loss, as most significant changes do. The gains were infrastructure and stability, and the broadening of what was possible. The losses were the particular freedom of an edge world, the specific quality of a place that is still making itself, and some of the people who had come for exactly that quality moved on when it became more ordinary. The Sullivans stayed. They had built something too specific to the place and too deeply rooted to be translated elsewhere. And beyond that, they had simply become of Redemption Creek in the way that people become of places when they have genuinely lived in them. When the town celebrated its 20th anniversary as an incorporated community in 1891, it was Lavinia Sullivan who was asked to give the formal address at the civic dinner, and she did so with the particular combination of practical precision and genuine feeling that characterized her at her best. And when she finished and sat back down next to Clarence, and he leaned over and said quietly, "Your father would have been very pleased," she held that for the rest of the evening. Elias VIII by then had already demonstrated that he was going to be a person of unusual capability, with his father's physical competence and his mother's organizational intelligence, and a social ease that seemed to belong to him alone. Clara, 6, was quietly taking in everything, and would later demonstrate that she had been doing so with complete retention. Thomas, 2, was in the process of becoming a small force of nature, and continued in this trajectory with great conviction. Ruth, who had become Sullivan and Talmadge's assistant manager, and eventually its full operational manager for day-to-day business, met a very steady young man named Daniel Cole, who came into the store in the spring of 1891 to buy seed, and returned 11 more times in the following month without quite managing to make his actual purpose clear. Until one afternoon Lavinia said to him, with the brisk affection of a woman who has been watching this unfold with complete clarity, "Ruth is finishing her work at 3 o'clock today, and she has mentioned that she enjoys walking in the evening." And Daniel Cole went bright red and came back at 3 o'clock on the dot and walked out of the store, beside Ruth with a look on his face that Lavinia recognized immediately, and that made Clarence laugh when she described it to him that evening. Ruth and Daniel were married the following year, and Ruth continued at the store without interruption, which Lavinia had specified was a condition of her endorsement of the courtship, delivered to Daniel with complete seriousness, and received by him with the appropriate deference of a man who understood the value of what he was being told. The letter itself, the original, the real one that had traveled such an extraordinary distance, was kept in the desk in the store's back office, folded in a small cedar box that Clarence had made for it. It was not displayed or discussed with anyone outside the two of them, because some things belong entirely to the people who lived them and require no wider audience to be meaningful. But on certain evenings, particularly in winter when the mountains outside the window were white and close, and the world had the particular quality of cold, clear isolation that had characterized the winter she wrote it, Lavinia would open the cedar box and look at her own handwriting on the faded envelope and think about what she had been when she wrote it, and what she had been when it came back to her, and what she was now. She was a woman with a store and a house and a husband and 3 children, and a town that was partly her town, a woman who had been a girl who came west with her father's optimism, a woman who had learned to be enough things at once that the list had long since stopped being relevant because she was simply, fully, herself. And the man who had come down from the hills with her letter, who had carried it for 2 years through all weathers and brought it back to her, who had built her house and fathered her children and stood beside her in every practical and intimate sense for over a decade. That man was sitting by the fireplace reading to their youngest in the low lamplight of a Colorado evening, and when he looked up and caught her eye across the room, what passed between them was everything the letter had said, and everything that could never be fully said in words, and it was enough. It was entirely, absolutely, forever enough. Redemption Creek, Colorado, 1892. The store was thriving, the house was full. The mountains stood in their permanent white authority above the town, and Lavinia Sullivan née Talmadge, daughter of Elias, keeper of accounts and of faith and of the ordinary extraordinary work of a life built on honesty, put the cedar box back in the desk and walked out to the fireplace to sit beside her husband and listen to the end of the story he was reading, and she did not look back. The winter was coming down from the mountains the way it always did, without apology and without delay, and in the Sullivan house on Main Street it was warm and the lamp was lit, and the children were near, and everything that had been lost and found and fought for and loved was present in that room, gathered and held and complete. Outside, Redemption Creek went on in the darkness and the cold. Inside, everything that mattered was still. And the letter rested in its cedar box, its purpose long since perfectly fulfilled.